Welcome to this edition of Water New Zealand's podcast series, Tawara or Tiwai. I'm Jon Reed from Water New Zealand, and today we're going to talk about microplastics contaminating biosolids in Aotearoa. We're joined today by two guests, Helena Ruffle and Derek Dignon. Helena is an environmental scientist who recently finished her PhD at the University of Canterbury. She was investigating the inputs and impacts of microplastics to productive soils in Aotearoa. Derek is a chemical engineer based in Australia who's been involved in the development of Australia's first carbonisation facility for biosolids. He's a technical manager at Aurecon. And helping me host the podcast today is David Romilly. He's an associate engineer at Aurecon and chair of the biosolids subgroup, part of the wastewater special interest group. We're very pleased to have all three of you with us today. Kia ora, Helena, Derek and David.
Kia ora, I'm excited to be here.
Kia ora.
Hi, everybody.
Thanks, Jon, for that introduction. Very excited to be part of this conversation. As part of the biosolids subgroup, which is underneath the wastewater special interest group, we get to do a lot of cool stuff in the space. Now that there is not been a biosolids subgroup to date, this is particularly important with the new wastewater standards that are coming out that are leaning heavily on the guidelines that Water New Zealand is developing. I've traveled from the States, both the East Coast and the West Coast, and this is a very hot topic. And in the state of Maine, they've prohibited the use of land application of biosolids. Much of the United States is looking at tracking contaminants like PFAS, and microplastics is one of the next big contaminants of concern out in the market. So as I landed here in Aotearoa, I started doing some work in the biosolids space, and I was fortunate enough to come across both Derek and Helena and the work that they do. Helena, can you just tell us a little bit about the work that you've done at university and how it plays into the biosolid space?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, David. So for my PhD, I sampled biosolids from 5 wastewater treatment plants across Aotearoa, as well as compost, but that's another story. And I isolated and characterized the microplastics from these biosolids. So in the biosolids, I found on average 2,700 microplastic particles per kilogram of biosolids. About 60% of that were irregular shaped fragments, 20% fibers, and the remaining were films and microbeads. The majority of the microplastic polymers found were polypropylene, about 30%, and polyethylene, about 26%, with the remainder being acrylic, 16%, and polyester, 13%. Interestingly, I also found biodegradable plastics in the biosolids, and also kitchen sponge fragments and glitter fragments. So these microplastics are coming from everyday products that we use in our home, including clothing, textiles, kitchen utensils, personal care products. Basically, any plastic product that we have in our home will shed microplastics, and these find their way down, wash down the drain and into wastewater treatment plants where they're not designed to remove microplastics. And as a result, they go out with the treated effluent, which I looked at for my master's, into the environment and in the purpose of today's conversation in the biosolids. So once these are applied onto land, there's no evidence that plastic, including compostable plastics, will actually ever biodegrade in soil. So that means that these microplastics will persist indefinitely in our productive soils. And some of the environmental impacts to soil health will be physical and chemical soil properties being negatively impacted, including microbial community structure will be altered, and also negative impacts on plant growth, including inhibition of photosynthesis, reduced germination, and reduced plant reproduction. So this is pretty scary in terms of food security as well. And I would just like to say that there are many sources of microplastics to the environment. Wastewater treatment plants are just one of them, but it is a source that we're often not really aware that we are contributing to.
So that answer has me concerned in a number of different ways. I think, Derek, could you help us walk through what the current state of play is in Australia with microplastics? in the work that you do?
Thanks, Dave. There's an increasing interest in microplastics or contaminants of emerging concern in Australia. Much of the focus to date has been on other contaminants such as PFAS, and there are changes to legislation, and various jurisdictions in Australia are updating their regulations. PFAS has been implemented in some of those jurisdictions, and microplastics is kind of the next on the radar. I think there's been a lot of discussion in local forums and conferences about certainly the impact of microplastics on health, and we're looking at the risks. But I think from a monitoring perspective, one of the question marks at the moment is on the analysis methods. So how you collect those samples and how you analyze them, and trying to get some comparable results between different samples from different parts of the country. I think that's one of the areas where there needs to be a uniform set of analysis standards, so that when we are comparing samples from different parts, we understand what that means, and those results are comparable. I think that's kind of where we are. There's certainly a lot of interest in treatment methods, and the thermal treatment methods is one of the pathways to remove those microplastics from biosolids. There's lots of interest in pyrolysis and gasification and incineration as possible treatment pathways.
Some of my past work was looking at that from a regionalization for biosolids treatment and handling. I like to call it more advanced thermal treatment, because we know we can dry biosolids, but it's that next step beyond it. And that's something that we're talking about in the biosolids space, from the land application, that biochar or ash that's produced from those products or those treatment technologies is excluded from the guidelines that are being written, because they're somewhat not considered biosolids at that point. They've gone through such a transformative state, or substantial transformation, I should say, to a different form and a different product. To that degree, Helen or Derek, can you talk about that once they've been treated, maybe with the thermal technology, if there's remaining plastics around, or what the residuals are from that process?
Yeah, I think our experience in Australia, Dave, and there is one biosolids advanced thermal treatment facility in Australia at the moment. And the experience from that project has been that the microplastics are significantly reduced in the final product. The variability in the destruction rate is impacted by a number of different factors. We know that the nature of the particles, the size of the particles, for instance, when they're treated, has an impact on that destruction efficiency. So we see variability in that destruction rate on particle size. We also see differences in destruction rate with the density of the particles. So I think really you talked about it in your comment about advanced thermal treatment and thermal treatment. So with pyrolysis and gasification, there needs to be some pre-drying step, which is the thermal treatment process you referred to, and that process has an impact on those particle characteristics, which then has an influence on the downstream destruction efficiency of those microplastics and other contaminants of emerging concern. In general, what we see is that microplastic destruction of more than 80% is sort of easily achievable. What we don't know is what the impact of some of the operating conditions have on the destruction efficiency, and that certainly requires a lot more investigation and effort. We have some idea of the type of microplastics which are destroyed in the process. We know that the larger particles require more effort to destroy. The really small ones are relatively easy to destroy. But there's certainly space for a lot more investigation, and I guess that comes back to my previous point on the measurement not only do we need the measurement in the biosolids, but in the biochar too, we need to categorize that and understand which of the particles are destroyed very easily and which ones need a bit more effort.
Yeah, and so that biochar is the product that I was talking about before, which is the not biosolids. But Helen, testing, I know that you did a fair amount of it, but you've also mentioned to me and Derek in past conversations, both here and the work that you did in Australia on testing. It's very challenging. There's a lot of different ways to do it, no standardization. Can you speak to that a little bit?
Yeah, absolutely. This is one of my favorite topics, actually. So, however you want to look for microplastics is extremely labor intensive and extremely expensive. So, I'm not sure if we'll be able to look at routine monitoring. So, I am very lucky and privileged to have been able to look at this work for sure. So, the work that I did in New Zealand at the University of Canterbury. So this was trying to analyze, extract the whole particles from biosolids. So trying to extract a solid from a solid is really challenging without actually damaging the microplastic. So I ended up developing a method, which I have published, to try and do this in a way that we have a really high recovery of microplastics without introducing contamination or destroying any of the particles. So basically, in turn, it basically involves just doing a gentle chemical oxidation of the biosolids to try and remove the organic material and free up the microplastics. And then using the power of density, we separate the microplastics based on their chemical density. And from there, I looked at all of the microplastics under the microscope, picked them all out with tweezers, so you can see how this is getting really expensive if you were to pay someone to do this. And then I put this under FTIR spectroscopy machine and went through each particle individually to determine if it was a plastic and what polymer type it was. So that was quite cool because I have photographs of every single microplastic, so I know their shape and I'll trace back what polymer type they are, so I can say that red fiber is polyester, which is really cool and really useful for toxicology purposes. However, this is limited to the larger microplastics that I can pick up with tweezers. So anything less than like 20 micrometers, we couldn't analyze. And research has shown that the majority of microplastics by mass is in the smaller fraction, so I'm missing out on a huge chunk of microplastics in the sample. And the results are based as particle count as a unit, so microplastics particles per gram of sample. I did an alternative method in Australia. I was really lucky to work at the University of Queensland with Professor Kevin Thomas and Dr. Elvis Okofo, who actually pioneered this method with biosolids, but I did this with compost, so I'm just going to share what it involves. So basically, it involves running a whole bunch of solvents through a small amount of sample to try under heat and pressure to try and dissolve the plastic polymers into solution. And then with those plastic polymers in solution, I took those extracts to Australia to run on their pyrolysis GCMS. So that in itself is quite a very, very expensive project, but it's a whole lot quicker than analysing microplastics under the microscope for sure. And then that gives you a mass balance of how many microplastics are in the sample, which is really useful because I got my results in milligrams of plastic of each polymer per gram of sample. But this is not without limitation because it's limited to the plastics which can dissolve in that specific solvent. So I was able to look at about 7 conventional plastics and 5 bioplastics, but these all have their own issues with determining how they are able to be analysed on the machine because there's some interferences with natural compounds. And so biosolids and compost, they're quite obviously very high in organic material, so some of the chemical fragments that these plastic polymers share are quite similar to those of natural compounds. So there's a lot of matrix interferences. So basically what I'm trying to say is we're not 100% confident on the numbers that method brings. So it's a really cool step, but we just need a lot more work involved for both methods, to be honest.
It's a complicated situation. What do you think regulators might end up looking at in terms of trying to control and move this whole process forwards? Helena or Derek, I don't know if you've got some ideas on that.
I think, John, from the experience with other contaminants of emerging concern, because there's a paucity of testing methods or data for a lot of the regulators to make decisions, there's a lot more collaboration, I think, even across geographical boundaries. So I know, for instance, in Queensland, they've taken a lot of advice from the US EPA, for instance, on PFAS testing methods and so on, and they follow the US EPA testing methods quite closely. Perhaps there's some collaboration that could happen because it is a global problem, as you pointed out, and we're not going to be the only area that has concerns about microplastics. So perhaps that's one avenue to explore, I guess. I'm not sure that there's an answer there yet, or that perhaps there has to be some other proxy method for measuring microplastics, which, dare I say it, Helena, isn't quite as accurate, but produces a result quicker to give you an idea of the level of pollution, even if it's not that accurate.
Yeah, would that be akin to, E. coli or enterococci being the indicator mechanism for which we test for effluent? There's an indicator method for microplastics and or maybe PFAS for that as an example. I can speak to the biosolids guideline that's being updated and to be published, but these are two very important areas that are identified as a data gap, and something that through the ANZBP, which is the Australia New Zealand Biosolids Partnership, that community is coming together to try to find ways to bring this forward in a sensible manner and give something back that can be regulated, safe for the environment, and really best for the community. So where do we go from here, though? Derek, you've mentioned a couple different technologies. I know with the guidelines that New Zealand is trying to put out, there is a goal of doing land application for biosolids because of, let's be fair, there are quite a number of benefits to using that beneficial product. There's a lot of nitrogen and phosphorus, and there's benefits that we can get out of that resource. So, Helena, what's your view on land application and or treatment? And then Derek, yours as well, please.
So I'm definitely team land application because it seems such an environmental disaster to be sending these really beneficial nutrients to landfill. But in saying that, the levels of microplastics that we are seeing are really concerning. So what I think really needs to happen is that we need to reassess our love affair with plastics, and we need to reduce the amount of plastic that we are using to reduce the instance of microplastics contamination. So this needs to go through supporting the Global Plastics Treaty and ensuring the most ambitious treaty we can to help regulate unnecessary plastic use, and also lobby as much as we can to our government to ensure that they are going through with these plastic product restrictions as well. And at home we can make conscious decisions about the products we buy and what type of material they're made from. So maybe not choosing that plastic kitchen sponge and going for something more natural as well.
Yeah, I think I echo what Helena says about, we have an addiction to plastic, let's call it, and certainly in Australia, what we're noticing is that some of the utilities here are advocating very strongly for source control as a way to reduce, for instance, PFAS in biosolids. And I think with plastics and microplastics, that there's probably a lot of value in pursuing that option first. I also agree with Helena that the nutrient content in the biosolids is too valuable for it to be wasted. we know that advanced thermal treatment technologies remove contaminants of emerging concern overwhelmingly. So, an 80% reduction, if you're doing land application of biosolids anyway, is a significant reduction in the amount of microplastics that's going back onto land. And I guess the trouble that everybody has with it is that there is no silver bullet at the moment. So advanced thermal treatment technologies perhaps aren't perfect just yet. However, if you are land applying biosolids, on balance, the impact to the environment is probably better with land applying thermally treated biosolids, advanced thermally treated biosolids onto land than not doing it, because you're still removing the vast majority of those contaminants. You're recovering the nutrient content that's in there, and all of that's contributing to the circular economy, which I think is of great environmental benefit. So the other thing that I will note is that certainly from our experience in Australia here with the project in Queensland, we've seen a big increase in the destruction efficiency of microplastics even over the last 2 or 3 years with that project. So we went from sort of 60% destruction during the demonstration phase of that project to now more than 80%. So the technology is certainly improving, and I think as adoption grows of advanced thermal treatment technologies, I think that will only improve. But what's probably going to be required to perfect the technology or get those destruction efficiencies up to much higher levels is more adoption. You've got to test it, and you've got to have more people using it and testing results and optimizing it to be able to improve it.
At one point there was just primary treatment for wastewater, and then secondary treatment became the norm. And now we're seeing that tertiary treatment and even RO almost being considered and mandated in some areas because we need that advanced treatment for our water side. It would be great to see that on the biosolids side, because it is such a valuable resource, and having it be safe for the environment and for the community is really what should be focused upon.
So interested to hear, really, Helena, maybe the proportion of microplastics that's coming through in biosolids. How much is that compared to what you see in water? And then any ideas? Is this where all the problem is that we're dealing with, or is there a bigger source control problem we should be thinking about?
Some of the research that's coming from overseas is saying that the retention of microplastics throughout the wastewater treatment plant is about 99%, often about 90 to 99%. So that means that the majority of these microplastics are being retained in the biosolids. But still, that 1% can still mean millions of microplastic particles going out into the ocean every day. So you can't really consider it to be an insignificant amount. From my master's research, however, I found the retention efficiency to be a lot lower. So Christchurch wastewater treatment plant was about 70% efficient. Well, not really efficient, but 70% retention from the incoming influent to the outgoing effluent. So yeah, there are still millions of microplastics going out to the Canterbury coastline every day, which is pretty scary.
Derek, any last thoughts about that sort of bigger picture? I don't know what you see microplastics from other sources, or is it mostly the water industry thing?
Well, I guess when you're looking at land application of biosolids or biochar, there's other products that get applied to land, like compost, for instance. And I think certainly I know that there have been issues with other contaminants which have come from compost and been applied to soils. So certainly there needs to be a broader evaluation of all of the products that I guess are applied to soils that are producing food crops that get into the food chain. How you go about that, I'm not sure, but legislation, I guess, should be uniform across all of the products, looking at where they're applied.
Yeah, would it be fair to say, from the context of what we accept in our lives without knowing, we've certainly painted a bit of a doom and gloom with microplastics, but there's a lot of stuff that we accept into our lives without questioning it, like the use of Teflon pans and PFAS that's associated with that. But we cook on it every day, so there's changes we can make. So yes, there's microplastics in the biosolids. Yes, there's PFAS in the biosolids. Yes, we want to apply it to land, but there is ongoing work to try to understand to what level of risk that poses to humans and aquatic life and the ecology. So I'm confident that the work that's being done, that we're going to try to find those right answers so we make right decisions. And I'm really excited for the work that both of you do. I'm passionate about that biosolid space and seeing that become a beneficial byproduct and something that we can use in that circular economy context, because it is a shame that we just throw it away. It is a shame that it is considered a waste, when in today's world we can do so much more. I feel that we can do so much better as a community. But that's what I have to say on where I see it going and where I hope to see it go.
Thank you, Helena and Derek, for joining David and myself today. It's great to talk to you about microplastics and find out more about how they're affecting our biosolids and also some possible solutions. Thank you for listening to this latest episode. We'll be back next month with our next podcast.